Hi, everyone. My name is Christy Statz, and I'm joining you from Ohio. And I'm really pleased to be able to present this webinar for you today. It is a joint effort from the Evangelical Immigration Table and from World Relief. I've got some friends on with me from a couple different parts of the border, as well as a friend who speaks nationally for World Relief, who are going to be able to explain a little bit more about what has been happening with our border policy, and more importantly, with people the last few weeks, the last year, and then how we as Christians can think about some of the changing dynamics and honestly, probably some ministry opportunities that you guys can get involved with from afar. So thank you for joining us. This webinar will be recorded. And so at the end of this, later today, you'll get an email from me with a copy of that. And I'd just like to welcome you to share it. It's free. So if this is something that would be helpful for your small group or your church or your friend from high school, feel free to share it with other folks. Now I'd like to invite some of our border leaders to join us today. We have Jane Register from World Relief in San Diego and Sammy DiPasquale from Ibarra Frontiers in El Paso, Juarez. Thank you for joining me, guys.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
So many people are familiar with World Relief. There's probably some folks less familiar with Ibarra, but I'm also assuming there's people who don't know about either of your work. Would each of you share a little bit about what is the work of World Relief that you're involved with, and what does Ibarra do?
So I'll share about World Relief in San Diego. So in San Diego, we serve immigrants of all statuses. We're kind of uniquely situated because we are a huge resettlement city, but we're also right by the border. So we also are serving families that are coming through the border. So we serve through providing immigration legal services, case management, donations, English, career mentorship, youth tutoring. We also have host homes and good neighbor teams. So a lot of what we do is we train followers of Jesus from local churches to walk alongside the most vulnerable. And we've also partnered formally and informally with migrant shelters on both sides of the border. We help by providing food, clothing resources, financial donations to help resource the services that they're providing.
Great, thanks, Jane. Sammy?
Yes, and I'm Sammy DiPasquale, and I'll share a little bit about Ibarra. We are in El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, Mexico. We're a binational team working on both sides of the border. And our mission really is in response to global migration in a polarizing world. At Ibarra here, we're working to inspire connections beyond borders through mutual understanding, education, and meaningful action. And this is sort of in pursuit of, we would say, a narrative change, systems change, personal change. Sort of how do we see transformation in ourselves of the narratives that we're a part of, and then sort of the systems that come out of those narratives. Practically speaking, then in the sort of education understanding sphere, a lot of what we do are border encounters or opportunities for people, denominations, churches, organizations to come visit the border for a number of days and hear firsthand from the people of the borderlands, really diverse groups, meet with asylum seekers in shelters, or talk with Border Patrol, or visit ICE detention facilities, sort of really hear from faith leaders. We try to hit a broad variety of different voices in the borderland. Then in terms of sort of border response or shelter support, we try to support a network of over 30 shelters on both sides of the border. And when I say shelters, most of those are churches that have opened their doors sort of as pop-up shelters. And so some of the areas we're involved in those shelters are anything from leadership and micro enterprise workshops in the shelters to leader equipping and respite care, art therapy workshops at unaccompanied minor shelter resourcing, just providing resources, asylum narrative translation project, trying to capture asylum seekers' stories. And then more and more, at least recently, has been working with the unhoused, those on the streets, both in Juarez and in El Paso, directly supporting those needs. And in the big picture, we're developing a Barra House, which is a sort of center, a borderland center for beloved community, where it's a 4-acre campus sitting right on the border fence, where we hope to engage in these issues over time. And we're just sort of entering into the development phase.
That's awesome. Thank you both so much. You guys have a lot going on with both of your work and ministries, and it's an honor to partner with y'all. So the global refugee crisis has grown significantly, almost doubling in the last 8 years. How would you guys say that has come to the border? And then have you seen a shift in who is coming? And yeah, what does that look like for y'all?
So it's interesting because with those numbers doubling globally, we've actually seen record low refugee admissions. So that's led naturally to an increase in displaced people seeking asylum via the border. So people that don't have access to the refugee pipelines from their regions are taking these alternative routes through Mexico. So we're seeing people that are arriving from Brazil, from Venezuela that have come on foot. And they're coming to the U.S. to seek refuge. So we're seeing the impact of these growing numbers in this kind of delayed manner as people are traveling on grounds, by car, walking with their kids and their families. So the shift that we're seeing a lot right now is people that are arriving from Afghanistan, Russia, Cuba, Congo, Haiti, Iran, Venezuela, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Mexico, Colombia. And each country is so different, the reasons that they've left. And so, for some, they're Christians that are fleeing persecution in their home countries. For some, it's the drug cartel. For some, it's corruption in the government and violence. So it's such a huge array of reasons that people are fleeing and coming to the border to seek asylum.
Hmm. Would you say it's similar for you, Sammy, or would you want to add anything?
I think some similarities, maybe the dynamics of who's coming to our area are a little bit different, but like 1 year ago, even, I think Border Patrol would say that the vast majority of those arriving were from the Northern Triangle and parts of Mexico in the El Paso sector. So Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, parts of Mexico. Last August, we saw large increases arriving from Venezuela overland from South America, and then a few months later from Nicaragua. And sort of Haiti and Cuba have been consistent, sort of smaller numbers. I think the sector's probably seen 120 countries, some people arriving on the border, but most of those are in small degrees, but there are more from Turkey, China, India. So it's interesting because, there's a lot of similarities on the border, and then you have pockets in different parts of the border of groups that come from certain nationalities.
When you see it change, so for example, it used to be Northern Triangle, and then now we're seeing an uptick in Venezuelans and Nicaraguans and Cubans and Haitians. Can you tell us anything about what has changed or what's going on in those countries that they are now such large numbers of our asylum seekers?
Well, yeah, I mean, each situation is so unique, but in Venezuela, I think, as we've seen sort of economic and somewhat political collapse over the last few years, some of the stats say that 1/4 of Venezuelans have left Venezuela in that time period, over 4 million potentially. I think the early numbers we saw, 2-3 years ago were mostly those with means to fly into the United States or had some sort of avenue to come in. And then, Colombia in particular was overrun as a neighboring nation with, 2.5 million potentially Venezuelans. And then you start seeing, as people are just realizing they can't really make it, you start seeing the flows coming north. So that's like one example.
Yeah, that's helpful.
And Jane probably has a lot of others.
I mean, similarly, we've heard, kind of similar reasons, just unlivable, a lot of violence Some of it is just corruption in the local government. And so families don't have access to resources. Just being able to buy groceries has become almost impossible. So they're unable to feed their families because of inflation. They're not able to buy groceries. And there was one woman who told me the amount that she was making in 1 month is what she could, that amount is what she had to pay for one piece of chicken. And so she was like, how do I feed my family? It's not livable here. So I have to leave. Not that she wanted to leave, but she had to leave.
Wow, that's hard. I visited Cuba last August and I saw bread lines and wasn't able to get into any of the grocery stores because people would wait for 4 and 5 hours on the street in a long line to get in. And sometimes they get in and there'd be like nothing left. And so having conversations with Cubans about the state of food scarcity was really shocking. And I was like, oh, that's why Cubans are now coming in large numbers the way they have in the 80s, which hadn't been the numbers for a bit. So this webinar really has come about by something called Title 42. And so for people who have heard this a lot in the news, but aren't sure what it is, Title 42 was a pandemic era health protocol that was put in place by President Trump in March of 2020. And it basically said the border is closed because of health concerns. And so Title 42 allowed the U.S. over the last 3 years to deport many people and prevent them from asking for asylum. So people would come to the border, instead of getting processed, they would get sent immediately back into Mexico under this health policy. So that's what some of that is, if you've heard it in the news. But my question for both of you is, how has Title 42 impacted your ministry or ministries that you partner with in Mexico? And then do you think it has been a good policy or a harmful policy? If harmful, what would you like to see happen instead?
For us, we've really seen it impacting our partner ministries in Tijuana. So they're serving families for longer periods of time. And so it's straining their already strained resources. They don't typically house people for as long as they've been. And so I think for us, we can see the practicality of Title 42, and we can see how it was necessary during the height of the pandemic. But I think for our organization, the harm that we've seen is the discriminatory ways and the ways that it was applied to reject or allow people. Or so maybe it wasn't applied when Ukrainians were coming through. And so I think it's been interesting seeing that the way that it's actually played out.
There's been a lot of confusion. So I know I've seen from the news all the time that lots of people are coming across the border. And then I know this health policy is in place. So you're right, they allowed some people to come in and kind of avoid it. And then other countries or nationalities, it was enforced, which is really complicated.
Exactly. Yeah.
What about you, Sammy?
Yeah, I think a lot of similarities in that regard, where essentially it was used, it seems, to target the countries where the most people were coming from. And so we used it with them. And so then what happened with the biggest volume, like say Guatemalans and Hondurans they're just sort of bounced back or stuck in Juarez. So that really affected the churches and the shelters in Juarez. And you'd see some of the smaller like communities or nations that had smaller communities arriving that would often make it through. And that's who the El Paso community would see. So like and if you haven't been to El Paso Juarez, where like the downtowns are right across the river from each other. So you have one population or a certain reality, a few blocks away from the other reality. And then of course, with having the privilege as U.S. citizens to go back and forth, just the dichotomy was sort of crazy. I think, underlying all of this and the reason even probably that Title 42 was enacted is just that we're trying to figure out through the executive branch ways of sort of dealing with the issues of immigration without actually having some sort of comprehensive immigration reform that would be helpful. And so you've got all sorts of different attempts at dealing with the situation, at varying degrees that work or don't work. But what's really needed is, I think, a real, solid look at what are our realities in the U.S., what are our current immigration policies, and how could we adjust those, both for the benefit of the United States and for the good of humanity.
Thank you. What's been the response of Mexican churches to more people in their city seeking asylum or trying to cross? And then how can American churches respond to the border or migrants coming to their cities elsewhere in the country? Sammy, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I could start. I think, like any community, you have a varied response. So you have some that don't want to be involved and don't want to touch it, and maybe are sort of would fall in and be like, oh, why are these people here? But then you have, in Juarez at least, so many churches that have stepped up, and most of these have been evangelical churches and a part of a network in Juarez called Red de Albergues, like this network of shelters that churches that became shelters. And to me, that's been an incredible source of inspiration and hope, because many of these churches are not well resourced. They're not large churches. They're small little street front churches, and they've not been helping out of their excess. They've been helping because they felt like this is what they should be doing as followers of Christ and what God's calling them to do in this time. And that has been incredibly humbling to watch. Sometimes the difference between like a wealthy church in the United States' response versus a struggling church in Mexico with a bivocational pastor, and oftentimes when they first start, and sometimes even long term, their sanctuary is turned into a place with cots or mattresses and people sleeping on the floor. And so this place of God has been turned into, is being used as a place of God in a different way. So I think, that's been an incredible inspiration to us. That there are many churches in El Paso that have stepped up too.
It's brilliant. And would you want to take some of the second part of that, Jane? So as American cities around the country are having more migrants come to their city, so there's even been busing programs going to places like Chicago. Like, how could we learn from the Mexican church? What are some helpful tips you would get as an American city that has had a lot of asylum seekers coming through? What are some best practices or ways that folks can respond as churches?
I know in San Diego that there's a network, and it's a rapid response network in San Diego. I don't know what exists in other border cities, but I would say get connected with that network. We've had a number of churches being a part of this kind of task force, and it's a range of different organizations, from county to cities, mayors, city councilmen, and then churches and local entities that are doing kind of community service and donations. So I would say get connected with that, do some research. And I would also say partner with the local shelters. A lot of our homeless shelters here are also serving as, migrant shelters as well. So collect donations to help resource those shelters. That can be clothing donations, food donations, financial. You can take an offering at your church. I know at least here, we have a need for volunteering at these shelters. So helping with kind of shelter operations. And some of that is providing childcare and doing like crafts and activities with kids. And then some of it's practical, being a transportation guide, so using Google Translate and printing bus passes, walking people to their bus or walking people to the gate at the airport. So I would say, taking a lot of cues from what we're seeing from our partner churches in Mexico, seeing just the hospitality that we've seen modeled. And really it's so simple, really simply kind of living out the gospel and practicing really this radical hospitality. So I know for us, we've really been so humbled by the response that we've seen in Mexico. And we've really been challenged. The churches here have been really challenged by the way that churches in Mexico have opened their doors and put bunk beds in, sanctuaries, and so I would encourage churches to think about maybe hosting in an unused classroom or meeting room in your church. So, or opening up a home, opening up a guest room.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I've got 2 more questions for you guys, and thank you so much for your time and just your wisdom and your experience on this. So this is my favorite question. What would you want someone to know about the border who doesn't live in a border city?
I could start. There's a lot of things. One, I would say the border is El Paso, and this is an incredibly welcoming place, and it's also a very safe place. El Paso is consistently ranked often in the top 3 safest large cities in the United States. So these perceptions we have sometimes, or the narratives that are perpetuated, I think it can be really harmful. And like we host groups all the time. We have a group this week from New York City, and they arrived, and we heard the leader talking to the college students. They're like, "We're not in New York City anymore. Be careful." And it was really humorous to us because, like, literally El Paso is incredibly safe. And when I was talking to some of the students, they were like, there's people getting killed in their neighborhoods all the time, and they're like very hesitant sometimes to walk out the door. So that's one thing. I think also, like, maybe some of you have seen in the news sort of pictures and video of people on the streets in El Paso, and there were at different critical points there have been hundreds or even a few thousand on the streets, and it of course you focus on the 1 or 2 or 3 blocks where everyone is. And what was striking to me was a friend who recently moved to El Paso, and he was like, I have gone my whole time here, the months, and never seen anyone on the streets. It's because it's in this concentrated space around one of the hospitality centers. And so one of my kids in elementary school goes to school 4 blocks from the church that's right by the border that everyone's congregated around. I drop off my son every day there, and there's nobody. And I often will drive down and sort of see what the situation is like. And so in that 4 blocks from where I drop off my son to Sacred Heart, where there's a lot of people congregated, there's no one on the streets for 3 out of those 4 blocks. And then there's a whole lot of people. And so we can frame this right in the media, or however we're framing it, in however we want to. And of course, we're focusing in on this immense human need that really is an immense human need, but it's concentrated, and that is not the entirety of the border. It's not the entirety of our city. It's a tiny little part of our city. And for the most part, there's hardly been anyone on the streets because oftentimes it's because the faith communities have opened up their doors and been welcoming and been processing. And so oftentimes it's interesting because people inside the country seem more concerned about the border and maybe even frustrated or angry than those of us who are at the border. I rarely run into anyone in El Paso who's really angry about anything that's happening here. Most people are like, how can we help out, and what can we do?
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. What would you add, Jane?
I would add that it's really important to understand that what's happening at the border is indicative of what's happening globally. So it's not happening in a vacuum. It's not just this random thing that's happening at the border, but it's a result of what's happening in their home countries. And so it's really important for us to be informed, to watch the news, read the news, research, and look at what's causing this mass displacement and understand that it's happening. What's happening is very complex. It's very interconnected. And I would say pray for each of these countries, these home countries that people are leaving. And I'd want them to understand that the process of seeking asylum in the U.S. is a legal process. And so Title 42 was a health ordinance, and so it being lifted is actually just allowing people to resume seeking asylum, this legal process of seeking asylum in the US. So just getting, properly informed and educated on what Title 42 is, what is happening in each of these countries.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you. So last question on that. And when I send the follow-up webinar recording to everyone, I really want to be able to send them some ways to partner with your ministries. So are there ways people can get involved with Abara or with World Relief from afar? What's the best way to partner with you guys? And you can shamelessly ask for money too. I'm okay with that.
Well, if anyone's interested, you can visit our website, abara.org, abara.org. And under border response, we have listed sort of a lot of the ways that we're involved, and also a connection through to a migrant assistance fund where people can make financial donations. There's also a link to an Amazon wish list, which is sort of the most needed items by the shelter networks or those who are unhoused. And so we maintain a small warehouse and collect donations and then distribute where they're needed most. I would also say if your community or you are interested in learning more, we would invite you here or consider a border encounter to bring a group to try to learn firsthand. It's a way, I think, to think through, like I would just resonate so much with what Jane shared about this global issue and how do we fit in and what, the complications of all of these factors. What do we do about root causes? We can respond on the border, but nothing starts or ends at the border. The border is not the crisis. The border is indicative of what's happening elsewhere. And so what are these bigger issues, these root causes, and how could we be involved? And so I think churches can be involved from maybe, finding partner organizations or an organization like World Relief that's working to try to stabilize situations or come up with solutions in countries that people are fleeing, as well as churches could help support what's happening on the border, come learn what's happening at the border, and then the importance of just being involved in their own communities, what's happening in your own neighborhood, who's ending up in your city. That is probably the most important thing that any church could do. Are people who are arriving in the city in your community being embraced and welcomed, or are they feeling isolated and alone and as if they don't belong? And then imagining kids growing up in that environment. And so just in those different ways, as well as just, we would invite prayers for those who are at the border, for those who are in incredibly tough situations, and it's probably for the teams of people who are working here for sustenance and continued strength.
Thanks. What about World Relief, Jane?
I echo a lot of what Sammy was saying. I think we also run these monthly trips, educational trips for people to learn about what's happening at the border. And I think adding to what Sammy shared, praying for the safety of families that are arriving, safe and humane treatment, and also praying for kind and compassionate churches that will step up and walk alongside them and shelter them. Also, we're seeing a lot of unaccompanied children in San Diego, so that pray that God will move people's hearts to foster and provide guardianship for these unaccompanied children. And also for us locally, just to pray for host homes, for more host homes, for housing in San Diego, and you're welcome to donate to us. Those donations will go to help fund our partner migrant centers and shelters on both sides of the border.
Thank you so much. Both of you, thank you for your time. I know you have very busy schedules, and really appreciate just the wealth of wisdom you have given us. I will let you go, guys, close your cameras, and then I will invite our next speaker on. We have my friend Matthew Sorens, Matt has a new title, Vice President. Are you still the head of church mobilization? Yes, head of church mobilization for World Relief, but you're also now Vice President. Is that the right title?
The Vice President of Advocacy and Policy, but part of advocacy and policy is certainly still church mobilization as well.
Vice President of Advocacy. I should get that right before I invite you to do a seminar. Sorry about that.
Right.
Thanks so much for joining us. Now, I wanted to kind of put your advocacy and policy a little bit out there a bit. First, Jane kind of mentioned that asylum was legal, but could you give us maybe a little more background of asylum? What is it? Why is it important? How long has it been part of the U.S. law? Tell us, for those who don't have a lot of information about that.
Yeah, I think the history is actually really important because it speaks to why it's so important from my perspective that we not turn our back on this legal commitment to offering asylum. So the background of where we got asylum laws in the United States, of course, people have been fleeing bad situations and coming to the United States for a long time. But as immigration laws restricted beginning in the 1920s, there were people who wanted to flee persecution and come to the United States and were actually turned away. And probably the most dramatic and horrific of that dynamic was in the days leading up to World War II, when Jewish people were fleeing from Europe, arrived on boats and said, can I stay here because we're concerned about this new government that's come to power in Germany that's going to do bad things to us. And the US, of course, did take some Jewish refugees in, but also sent some back. And in the years after the war, and of course, we were not the only country that did that, there was sort of an international recognition that that was a moral failing, that we should not have sent people back to be killed. And the effect of that was in 1951, an international convention on the status of refugees that basically gave us the definition in international law of a refugee, someone who's fled their country because of a credible fear of persecution, because of race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or a particular social group. And it also set up this principle that, if somebody shows up in your country and they can demonstrate that they meet that definition, that's called seeking asylum. It's refugee resettlement when someone is identified overseas and then brought to the United States on an airplane. But seeking asylum is when someone gets on their own to the United States or to any other country that has similar laws, and basically says, please don't send me back because I'd face a credible fear of persecution. That convention was drafted originally in 1951. Eventually, some years later, the U.S. affirmed that. So our Senate passed that as international treaty. And then the U.S. government actually put that into law in 1980 with the Refugee Act of 1980, which interestingly passed unanimously through the U.S. Senate and with very, very broad bipartisan support in the U.S. House of Representatives and signed by President Carter. So that's been U.S. law for a long time, that if you reach the United States, whether on a temporary visa, like you flew in with a student visa or a tourist visa, or you can reach the border and you can demonstrate that you have a credible fear of persecution on account of your race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or particular social group, you'll be allowed to stay and eventually allowed permanent residence and in a process where you could pursue citizenship. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone shows up gets to stay. It means everyone has the right to due process, meaning to that process to prove whether or not they qualify. And the burden of proof in our system is on the applicant. So I've known people who I believe they had a credible fear, but they didn't necessarily have documentary evidence of it. The challenge of Title 42 has been that even if you had that evidence, the country was closed to asylum. And then gradually there's been certain countries of nationality that have been accepted from that public health rule, which doesn't make any sense from a public health perspective because certain nationalities were more prone to COVID than others. A lot of that was actually governed not just by U.S. policy, but by Mexican policy. The government, Title 42 actually wasn't deporting people back to their countries of origin. It was very quickly expelling them to Mexico, even if they're Venezuelan or Guatemalan or various other nationalities. And so that only worked as long as Mexico was willing to take them back. And so Mexico gradually changed their own rules on who they would take back. And as they said, no, we won't take back Venezuelans for a time, or Cubans, or certain other groups. That's where we started to see large numbers of people from some of the countries that are not the traditional countries. It used to be mostly, 3-4 years ago, mostly the Northern Triangle of Central America would be showing up and seeking asylum. In the last year, there's still some of those people, but they were largely being turned back to Mexico. Whereas certain other nationalities have been allowed to come and basically be processed under our normal immigration laws. And now at the end of Title 42, which is, again, a public health law. So it's a decision from the Center for Disease Control that made Title 42 go away. Theoretically, we would have hoped that now we'd just have a functional asylum system. But what we've seen is actually the Biden administration has put some new rules, very similar to some rules that the Trump administration had proposed and that were struck down by courts under the Trump administration, to restrict who can seek asylum in the United States. So it's still not at all accurate. It's not even accurate that we're going back to our normal immigration laws. It is It is now true that there is an app that people can use to request an asylum a preliminary asylum review at the port of entry, which theoretically I think is a good idea. It's called the CBP1 app. The problem is there's far fewer slots for appointments than there are people seeking asylum. So in effect, a large number of people are being turned back to Mexico, even despite the end of Title 42, or in some cases, if they do cross unlawfully, they're being not just expelled back to Mexico, but removed to their country of origin in a formal deportation process that can also have long-term legal consequences for them.
I think what you said was really helpful because I get so many questions about the border and people confused about what's happening. And I think what you just did was highlight the absolute chaos of our federal policy. And this has to do with the Biden administration and the Trump administration and Congress. So they're all culpable for this chaos. So the pandemic health restriction, Title 42 prevents people from asking for legal asylum. And then you basically have this fight back and forth between us and Mexico at who they're going to take, which means while the border is really completely closed, some of those many people that got bounced into Mexico, suddenly Mexico won't let them stay. And so then the US lets them in. So that's where you're seeing that kind of inconsistency at who's coming in, whether it's closed or not. You're seeing Venezuelans get bused to DC, and then other folks aren't even able to ask for asylum on the border. And so that kind of helps clarify the inconsistency.
Yeah, and I think it's
really
worth noting
for everyone watching.
It's particularly frustrating for the people who are affected by this, who are trying to go follow the rules and cannot figure out what the rules are. And it's very hard to get a straight answer. And I think it is important to know, even those who, like Mexico, under Title 42, who Mexico would not take back, and who the U.S. then does allow to pursue an asylum claim, they are usually released in the United States. Some of them are detained in detention centers, but some of them are released. They come to communities like where I live outside of Chicago, but they have a removal, they have a court order to appear to court to determine if they qualify to stay permanently or not. And if not, they have the likelihood of facing removal at that point. But that hits this whole other dysfunction under our laws, which that our asylum system is so incredibly backlogged. On average, if you're in immigration court, it takes about 4 to 5 years to get a final decision on your asylum hearing. And there's some that can move faster, but there's also some that, are taking 10 years or more. And that begs this hard question, well, what do you do with people in the meantime? Do you let them work? Do you not let them work? Do you hold them in a detention facility, which is expensive? Or do you let them be released? It turns out most people, if they're released, do show up for court. And part of that is people are often having, I have a friend who's got a GPS ankle bracelet on his ankle to make sure that he shows up for court when he's supposed to. And he would have done so anyway. He's very eager to present his asylum claim. But again, that's only for those who are allowed in to pursue asylum. Others are held in detention pretending their asylum claim. Others are required to wait in Mexico, or even are now under the new policy deported right back to their country of origin because they're on a very quick process determined not to qualify.
That's a lot of chaos and inconsistency. And I don't know an American outside of us nerds in the immigration space that can explain that. So I can imagine why someone from Venezuela doesn't understand what's legal and what's not and what should happen. That's really hard. Matt, can you talk to the U.S. has had an increasing number of families coming to the border over the years. I think I've seen a chart out there and the numbers have just gone straight up. What would policies or systems that our government could do to honor asylum, but make our best border less overwhelmed in general, but I'd say particularly for families? How do we take care of the dignity of the family? We've seen really harsh policies that have separated families from one another, especially the infamous child separation policy. What would you say would be policies, especially as Christians, that we can get behind that really honor the dignity of the family?
Yeah. That's, I think, really important. And what you're hitting at there, Christy, is so important, that there are various values that ought to be guiding us, I think, as a country, and especially for those of us who come to this from a Christian perspective. Like, I think it's appropriate to want and to insist from our government that we have secure borders. That is to say, it's our government's responsibility to know who's coming into the country, to do everything reasonably possible to keep out anyone seeking to do harm. At the same time, we also have a commitment to honor the dignity of every person made in the image of God and to protect human life, which is why we have asylum policies. And to be able to discern between someone seeking to do harm, which is a very small share of people who'd come to the border, but that could exist, from those who are actually fleeing from harm and are seeking protection in the United States under the terms of U.S. law. And then again, as you said, another really important principle, like we, as Christians, we believe that God establishes and ordains government for a purpose. We see that in Romans 13 and elsewhere in the scriptures, but he also, even earlier, ordains the family unit. Like God establishes family and he wants families to be together. That's the ideal situation. And so I think when it comes to federal policy, we should certainly be looking at what can we do to keep families together whenever possible. So, for example, you talked about the family separation policy as a great negative example of that. Basically what happened there was adults were criminally charged for unlawful entry, even when their unlawful entry was in order to pursue asylum under the terms of U.S. law, and their children were then categorized as unaccompanied, as if they'd showed up by themselves without a parent, and in many cases not even tracked who their parent was. It was just a horrific situation for a lot of very, very vulnerable families. But I think one thing that is still happening is families are still separated, not by an intentional policy like we saw in 2018, and I'm grateful for that. But for example, when we treat unaccompanied children one way, but it's impossible to seek asylum as a family unit, some very desperate families will make the decision, I guess I should just send my kids across on their own. That unfortunately happens. And so some of those unaccompanied kids who we hear about in the news, who our government, has legal processes to protect and has sometimes done so well, and unfortunately sometimes not done so well. But some of them have parents sitting on the other side of the border in Mexico, and they were turned away from seeking asylum as a family unit and made this very desperate decision. So how do we address that? I think one thing is we should be, and this is not just for families, but really for everyone, we should have a much more robust asylum processing capacity at the border so that you could, I don't have a problem with them using an app as an orderly system, but there should be a way to get an appointment with the app, not a far smaller number of appointments than there are people who actually need to seek asylum. At the same time, there should also be more legal channels for migration for those who are still in their countries of origin. I mean, that could be, or who are in a neighboring country. So that would be refugee resettlement. If you fled your country of origin, you're a Venezuelan in Colombia. If we had been doing more refugee resettlement, and Jane alluded to this earlier, I think we should have been doing much larger numbers of refugees being resettled out of the Venezuelan crisis for the last decade at least, and we weren't. And one of the effects is people became sufficiently desperate that they made a really dangerous journey to the last legal recourse to seek protection in the United States, which is asylum, which requires you to get to the border. But I wish we would still do more refugee resettlement from around the world, but including within the Western Hemisphere. But also, frankly, not just refugee resettlement for those fleeing a credible fear of persecution. There's also people who really aren't fleeing persecution, they're fleeing poverty. And if they could get to the United States and be authorized to work, we have millions of more jobs than we have people looking for work in this country. And many of them are jobs that you don't actually have to speak English for, in agriculture or certain other parts of our sectors of our economy and hospitality industries, construction. These are parts of our economy that historically have relied really heavily on immigrant labor. The problem isn't that we have a lot of people arriving. The problem is that we have a lot of people arriving who are then not authorized to work for months or even years. And yet, I'd rather than making them come to the border to seek asylum, I wish we'd have more work-based visas available at the consulate in your country of origin, where you could then come on an airplane and through, pay a reasonable fee to go through a background check. People would be happy to do that if those sort of visas were available, whether a temporary work visa or a permanent work visa. And so increasing those legal avenues for migration is another thing that would have a dramatic effect at reducing the number of people who would come to the border at a point of desperation.
I think that is really, really helpful, Matt. And, when you spell that all out, I think people can visualize that. We got a question in the Q&A, and I forgot to mention this at the beginning, so thank you for utilizing that. If anyone else has questions, post them in the Q&A function, and we will do a Q&A at the end. So as soon as Matt and I finish this, we're going to switch to questions. So I forgot to mention that, and I'm so glad someone utilized that already. The Evangelical Immigration Table, which is a coalition that you help coordinate and World Relief is a part of. So there's 10 principal organizations that make up the Evangelical Immigration Table. They have advocated for values that are in alignment with Scripture. Could you share some of those ideas when it comes to our border?
Yeah, I mean, some of them are the ones I mentioned. It's recognizing the dignity of every human person made in the image of God. It's affirming that we need and ought to have secure borders, and our government has that responsibility. It's recognizing that we should keep families united whenever possible. And again, those are 3 of the 6 of our statement of principles that we launched with back in 2012. So these are not new ideas, and they're all rooted. And we even have a resource on our website of the Evangelical Immigration Table, a whole ebook on thinking biblically about immigration, looking at each of these principles and where we derive them from a theological and Christian perspective. I think as it relates to the border right now, we actually, as the table, World Release President and CEO, along with the leadership from other evangelical organizations like the National Association of Evangelicals, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, the National Latino Evangelical Coalition, and various others, have sent letters in the last several months, both to the Biden administration and to members of Congress in both sides of the aisle, both chambers, highlighting some of these principles that ought to apply. Yes, secure borders, but also respecting due process for asylum seekers because of our belief that human life is precious and made in the image of God. And I mean, I think we affirmed when the Biden administration opened up some new legal channels for migration, particularly for individuals from Venezuela, Cuba, Haiti, and Nicaragua. We also very forcefully dissented when they have reintroduced this policy similar to what the Trump administration introduced, and we dissented when the Trump administration did so as well. It's basically a third country asylum ban that says if you have to pass through another country on your way to seek asylum in the United States, you're presumed to be ineligible for asylum in the U.S. with certain exceptions. And those exceptions are worth noting, and there are more exceptions than there were under what the Trump administration approved, and then was blocked by the courts from actually implementing. But our view is, the law itself does not contain those exceptions, and we ought to respect our laws. Congress could amend our laws if they wanted to. Unfortunately, what we've seen from Congress, the House of Representatives passed a bill last week that personally I think doesn't fit those principles. It is under the auspices of we're going to secure the border, but its primary way of doing so is really dramatically restricting eligibility for asylum. Yeah. And also protections for unaccompanied children, and even the ability to use parole processes that are, something that has been a part of our law for a long time. It's how the U.S. brought Afghans to the United States in an urgent way. It's how the U.S. brought Ukrainians to the United States in an urgent way. That bill, if it passed as it's written in the House into law, would actually make it, very, very difficult to use parole in the future, which is a legal avenue for migration. And what we've seen is when you open up legal avenues, unlawful entries go down. And if you take away those lawful avenues, we'll see unlawful entries likely go up, especially from those particular countries of origin. So we don't think that bill is a solution, but we actually really desperately need legislative solutions, bipartisan, both because we think both sides have some things to offer to this conversation. We need secure borders, and we need humane treatment of immigrants, and we need more legal avenues for migration. We need to keep families together. But also bipartisan, because actually the way that Congress is right now, it is the only bill that will ever pass, must inherently be bipartisan. And so one side or the other passing bills with no support from the other side, where they've not done the work of finding consensus, is just a messaging bill. It's not designed to actually change anything on the ground. It's not ever going to become law unless there's good faith efforts for Republicans and Democrats and independents to actually sit together and find out what they could agree upon.
And I have a strong opinion, on that
You have a
messaging
strong opinion,
bills are not what they're getting paid for. They need to pass good policy. I have strong opinions about lots of things. No, I think that's really helpful, Matt. And if people are interested in reading more about these bills, we do good explainers, and some of our partner organizations do great explainers. So ping me a message after this, and I can, for the nerds out there who like to read bills and white papers that are in 10 pages and not 370, I can get you guys connected to some of those avenues. Matt, I'm going to throw a question on you that I gave Sammy and Jane about churches. So I'm in a church in Akron, Ohio. If a bunch of migrants get bused to Akron, Ohio, what would be a helpful response for us? Or what would you want to say to churches around the country that want to respond to the border or want to be prepared to respond to migrants and asylum seekers generally? What do we do?
Yeah. I mean, I would underscore something that Sammy said, which is, the situation at the border doesn't start at the border and it doesn't end at the border. It's a midway point, and some people get stuck on the southern side of the border and never are able to cross. More and more likely that will be their situation. New policies. Others, though, are allowed to cross, are allowed to pursue asylum, and very few of them stay in the border. I mean, usually within a day or two, they're on a bus or an airplane, usually with a ticket purchased by some friend somewhere in Chicago where I live, or in Akron where you live, or in Los Angeles or in Florida or New York, wherever, all across the country. It tends to be in communities where they know someone, tends to be in communities with large immigrant populations already. And those people show up, and often their family can host them while they wait for a court date. I should also mention there are people who end up in a detention for a very long period of time, and that's one of the ways we serve at World Relief. Our World Relief Western Washington office basically runs church services in one of the detention centers, and basically is providing spiritual and other support to people who are in detention. But then at communities throughout the United States, there are churches, and World Relief is a part of this. I know here in Chicagoland, where I'm based, we have a program called a home program that's basically very similar to our Good Neighbor team model for refugees who come in on airplanes, where a team from a local church will walk alongside a family and support them through their first number of months that they're adjusting to life in a new country, with the big distinction that asylum seekers in most cases are not authorized to work. So whereas with refugees who arrive authorized to work the day they arrive, there's a very strong focus on helping them find that first job and be economically self-sufficient. And with asylum seekers, they're not allowed to do that. And some of them still are doing that because realistically, there's not the support to help them. But one of the things that we do is we help find churches that can help provide housing, whether by paying for an apartment, or maybe they have a parsonage or other housing available that they can make available. And while that family goes through the process of seeking asylum. And that's another huge need all around the United States, is legal services. We know from lots of data on this that asylum seekers who have legal representation are much, much more likely to win their cases. But there is simply nothing near the number of immigration attorneys or Department of Justice accredited representatives who are authorized to represent someone in an immigration court as the need right now. And it's a huge challenge across the country. And all of those are ways that local churches can plug in, can connect directly in their own community, and through financial support as well. I mean, that's something I know both Sammy and Jane sort of mentioned, but I think we should mention even more directly, because it's a huge need right now. There's lots of good organizations and churches. Again, I'll mention World Relief, although there's others as well. But if you go to worldrelief.org/border, you can see some of the ways that you can give, and both address some of the challenges at the border, but also some of the needs as people arrive in communities throughout the United States as well.
It's really helpful. I want to make sure we can save the last 5 minutes for our questions. So I'm going to ask you this question, Matt, my last one, and I'm going to make you keep it short. You and I can both talk forever. What would you want Christians to know, to do, and to pray after this seminar? Last question.
I think what I'd love Christians to know is, let's start our conversations from the Bible. We've alluded to that a few times today, but we know from lots of research that most evangelical Christians actually don't primarily think about immigration as a biblical issue. And I think we want to encourage that. So we've got resources at World Relief and at the Evangelical Immigration Table to really start that process. If you're in one of those border communities, call Sammy at Ibarra and say, hey, I'd like to volunteer, or call Jane and her team at World Relief Southern California and San Diego. Or if you're elsewhere on the border, look for good organizations that are doing ministry on the border. But most of the people are not at the border. Reach out to ministries in your community that are caring for people once they arrive in those communities. And then pray. There's so many places for prayer. Pray for the countries that people are fleeing from, as Jane said, and the situations that are driving people out. Pray for the governments of those countries. Pray for our government, that are from the president down, members of Congress, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and others. Whether you like them or not, we're called in 1 Timothy to pray for kings and all those in authority. So we should be praying for them to have wisdom, to know what is a wise policy, and courage to do what is right. Pray for churches on both sides of the border and throughout that journey to know how to respond. And of course, probably most importantly, pray for the Border Patrol and others who have governmental responsibilities, who are very taxed right now, very difficult jobs as they seek to serve their responsibilities. And then most importantly, pray for those who are migrants, who are asylum seekers, whether they're on a journey or they're stuck in Mexico or they've been resettled, they're now in the United States, seeking asylum. Pray that God would protect them, that he would preserve lives, that he would allow people not just to survive, but to actually flourish, and to be able to bring their contributions and gifts to the ways that God has made them in his image, with potential to contribute, and to be able to actually contribute wherever they land.
That's great. And in the follow-up email, I'm going to have a link that you can directly subscribe to the Evangelical Immigration Table prayer updates. We meet once a month nationally for 30 minutes. It's not long. And we pray together. We send out updates on particular things you can advocate for. It's like a quick linking that you can send an email. So I'd really encourage you, if this is interesting, to sign up for those, and we would love you to join us. So we've got 4 questions, but 2 are so similar. I'm actually going to read them and combine them into one. And we're going to go backwards. So we're going to end with like the policy asks, but this is like a pastoral question. And I've talked to so many pastors that are struggling with this. What would be your advice on how to wield the Bible in this way? So 2 different folks have asked, how has polarization and an anti-immigrant narrative impacted the evangelical church and its core value to love thy neighbor? And I think you could probably put this into one question, Matt. In thinking of Matt's statement that when legal methods increase, illegal entries decrease, Matt, in your experience with church mobilization, what have been the helpful ways to address the racism and nationalism that drive people's perspectives on this issue? Convincing people they are here legally does not confront these issues prevailing in our churches. So love thy neighbor, and then anti-immigrant messages that are often nationalistic or prejudiced. What do we do with those? How do we engage folks biblically?
Yeah, very challenging questions. I mean, one place to start is by actually having conversations. As you know, the same surveys we've done with Lifeway Research that find that only about 1 in 5 evangelical Christians think about these issues from a primarily biblical perspective. They also find that it's just over 3 in 10 who've ever had a conversation in their church, encouraging them to reach out to immigrants. And so I think for pastors, that's intimidating. It can sound scary to even bring up this topic because it does elicit some strong opinions. But if we ground our conversation in scripture and be, balanced in the sense that we're not just cherry picking one verse, but looking at the range of biblical witness on this topic, my experience has been that the vast majority of evangelical Christians are actually very eager for that conversation. In fact, our survey found that too. I think it was about 7 in 10 who said they'd love to hear a sermon on this topic because they never, so many of them never have before. They're being discipled by either, politicians on one side of the aisle or another, or cable news or social media personalities. And they're not being discipled by their pastors. In many cases, they're not being discipled by God's word, which has so much to say on this topic. I can't promise every pastor that if you get up and preach on this on Sunday, everyone will love what they hear. But I think pastors would be surprised by if they do their homework, and we have resources for this at the Evangelical Bridge Table and at World Relief, to provide like a really grounded biblical perspective rooted in those, addressing some of the misconceptions. Because I think some of this is rooted in, absolutely some of it's rooted in racism. I've seen that, I'm on Twitter, I get comments back. But I also do think there is a lot that is rooted in genuine, well-meaning misunderstanding. And I think, when we provide people accurate information and from unbiased, nonpartisan sources, and pair that with the scriptures and pair that with some element of proximity to the stories, to letting people hear from people who are directly affected by this. It's really hard to go on a border trip with World Relief in Southern California or with Abara in Juarez and El Paso and meet people, meet brothers and sisters in Christ most of the time in a migrant shelter who've been there for 6 months, who want to, pray with you and pray for their families back in a dangerous situation, to be afraid of those people or to think that they're an invasion, which is just a really horrific, slanderous way to talk about. Again, not everyone is a brother and sister in Christ, but many are, and everyone is a neighbor whom we're called to love. And if we want to exclude, those people from the definition of a neighbor, we should remember that Jesus's example of what it means to love your neighbor was the Good Samaritan who showed compassion to a vulnerable traveler of a different ethnicity and religion who was in need. You're muted, Christy.
Muted. Oh man,
Made it this far.
It's not been 3 years. Yes, I've got this far and now I left it on. I was just gonna say that really echoes my experience. I find I spoke to a group of pastors a few months ago, and one of the pastors was like, why has no one ever said this? This is such helpful information. And I'm now speaking at his church on Sunday evening, a special event, just because he's like, no one knows, like, this is really helpful. And yeah, it was just a straight Bible talk going through, like, how do we engage this, through a biblical lens? Okay, last 2 questions. Y'all have been great. Thank you for being a part of this. Are there any current bills in Congress that include reforms for asylum, refugee resettlement, or other legal pathways that we can advocate for?
I would say, unfortunately, I don't think there's any viable bills that have a lot of chance of going through. There was a bill in the last Congress that we did support at World Relief. We didn't love every element of it, but we thought it was a good faith effort called the Bipartisan Border Solutions Act. That would have, the most significant thing it would have done would have been to dramatically increase asylum adjudication capacity at the border. And we think that's an important step towards addressing some of the challenges. Another bill that you know, I think would be a good step. I don't know how likely it is to pass, but Senator Collins and Senator Sinema have a bill that would reduce the time required to apply for work authorization after you seek asylum. Which again, the problem isn't actually there's a lot of people. The problem is there's a lot of people who are not authorized to work and not allowed to provide for themselves. That's where it becomes a real logistical challenge. It could actually be a solution to a huge labor shortage if we allowed people to work more quickly. But neither of those are like panacea, solve everything bills. And actually, as Sammy said this, we really fundamentally need just comprehensive reform our immigration laws, which are, you know, maybe made sense when they were written in 1965 or maybe amended in 1980 with the Refugee Act, but are woefully out of date to the current realities. And that's going to take a lot more work in terms of public policy. But I think that's, you know, that's where we would love to see the church be leading in this area.
So I have my 2 senators in my House of Reps person in my phone, and I call it my bat phone, and I just call them and haunt them and leave little messages, and they're wonderful staffers, write them all down for me. But you know, since there isn't a current like viable bill, I guess a general thing that you guys can do and not be a policy wonk is to call your 2 senators and your representative. And if you're Gen Z, I'm sorry, make a phone call. That's okay. But baby boomers here, you guys can make phone calls. Well done. And just leave a quick message. You're either going to get a staffer is going to pick up, and just be prepared to give your name, your address, because they want to know that you're a constituent, and then say, hey, I would like to see so-and-so work on comprehensive immigration reform. And you could even say that both secures our border and has compassion towards asylum seekers, that we don't end asylum. So you don't have to know lots of detailed policy things to even just borrow 2 of the things we say in the Evangelical Immigration Table Principles. Like you could leave a message every week, and if they get haunted with enough messages, they're going to go, maybe we should stop being so partisan or only doing messaging bills. Maybe we should go and work with our teammates on the other side of the aisle. So that's one way you can force them to engage with that idea. Last question, Matt, and then I will close this. Do you see, so you mentioned the Biden administration's new policies are similar to previous ones that were struck down under President Trump. Do you see these new policies being challenged in court soon? If they were to be struck down, what could possibly happen to the asylum pipeline from there?
Yeah, the Biden administration's policies have already been challenged in court. We don't have a decision yet, but there's been a lawsuit already filed, and on a legal basis that is very similar to lawsuits that were filed against the Trump administration's third country asylum bans, which were successful. I mean, the court struck that policy, prevented it from going forward. On one hand, I mean, I agree with most of the legal argument for that legal challenge. I think that the third country asylum ban is not actually what U.S. law says, and then on a moral level, I think it is restricting people who need protection from access to asylum. The other reality, though, is I completely agree with that. I think the Biden administration should not put this policy into effect. And yet the reality is what they've done right now is actually, I mean, the numbers have gone down really dramatically in the last week. There's all this push around people are going to come when Title 42 ends. Actually, it turns out people came to get in before Title 42 ended from certain nationalities. And things could change again. We don't know. They will almost certainly change if there's a lawsuit. And the lawsuits could go in multiple directions. There's different legal challenges at play right now. But a lot of this is not actually it's less about the substance of the policy and more about the uncertainty that it creates in a media narrative, where smugglers in particular, who have a profit incentive in persuading people that now's the time to come, will spread misinformation. And they use the fact that something's in the news, that something changed, to create, to find their business. And unfortunately, often they will treat people horrifically in that journey. And of course, they're violating laws by bringing people into the United States as well. But I think as there are legal challenges, the border goes through high and low times. But it's never like an issue that goes away. And it would take really dramatic reforms at a structural legislative level to make these issues be an orderly, well-managed border.
Great, that's really helpful. Well, with that, I'm going to close us out today. Matt, Jane, and Sammy, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time and your wisdom. And everyone who's been in the audience, just appreciate you guys sticking with us even an extra 6 minutes. I noticed everyone's still there. So really appreciate you. If questions come up in the future, feel free to still send me an email, send Matt an email. We'd love to engage with them. And if this event was helpful for you and you think, I'd like to be able to do something like this in my church or my school or university, feel free to reach out and we would love to help you put something like this on for free because this stuff really matters, especially the part about engaging biblically and how we think about this as Christians. So really appreciate you guys. Thanks for your time and have a really fabulous Thursday.